This week, welcome to part 2 of coverage of Israel's recent election. In the last episode, I talked about the rise of bigoted far-right politicians not being the huge watershed moment many of us feared. In this one, I'll talk about what it does represent for Israel, but mostly for American and Diaspora Jews. I'm Lev Gringauz, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. If you want to subscribe to our weekly TC Jew Folk newsletter for local Minnesota Jewish news, our monthly podcast newsletter for updates on all our podcasts, or our soon-to-fully-launched newsletter for Cincinnati Jewish news, go to tcjewfolk.com and hit that subscribe button at the top of the screen. We recently updated our food podcast, now called Not Your Bubby's Nosh, so go check that out, and we're also rolling again with Kumba Hineni, our social justice and intersectionality podcast. Links for everything in the podcast notes. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 276 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Okay, let's talk Israel again. I'm warning you, this is a less cohesive and thought-out episode than I normally strive for. There are some distinct takeaways I have, and then there's this weird, bigger picture that's really hard for me to stop thinking about, but it also has so many elements and caveats. So I don't know, let's go on this adventure and see where we end up. And if you get angry with me, just remember I'm probably more angry with myself for not being able to clearly explain what I'm trying to explain. So here's the big brain thought I'm having. It feels to me that the Israeli election results are, in a way, an indictment of mainstream American Jewish pro-Israel advocacy. Before you react to that, just hold on. I know that sounds a little too big brain and weird. Let's get to some context, and then I'll explain why I'm having this thought and what I think it means. So if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I highly recommend you do that to get the most out of this one. But to briefly recap, the results of Israel's November 1st election points to the formation of a right-wing government with the return of Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. One of the right-wing parties, really a group of right-wing parties that ran together that Netanyahu needs as part of his government coalition, includes a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir, a bigoted anti-Arab and anti-LGBTQ extremist. Ben-Gvir is a follower of the late American-Israeli extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane, and also advocates for Orthodox Jewish law to be the standard way Israel does things. In other words, no room for reform or conservative Judaism. And while Ben-Gvir is the prominent face of this ideology, it's echoed by others in his party, and now these guys likely get to shape the policy of the Jewish state and speak for it, too. This is a level of Israeli extremism being in close proximity to power that scares a lot of people, including many American Jews, and feels like a threshold has been crossed for Israel when it comes to mainstreaming bigotry. In the last episode, I tried to mediate some of the fears about that, not because everything is fine, it's not, but because when you crunch the numbers, Ben-Gvir doesn't represent some sudden Israeli societal and electoral shift toward extremism. The votes just don't show that. Rather, he's in this position because of a failure of the Israeli left to translate votes into actual political power in the election. Ben-Gvir is still dangerous, as we'll get to, but not necessarily in the way many of us felt he was. That's the TLDR, but now I want to flip things again, because Ben-Gvir doesn't represent some sudden rise in Israeli extremism, but we do need to talk about what he does represent in Israel, which is a much broader trend over several years of growing right-wing extremism. In other words, it's easy to look at Ben-Gvir and panic and think he's the problem. But really, he's a symptom of the broader problem, and this distinction is going to become really important as I come back to the American Jewish and diaspora side of things and what all this means for us. I'm going to focus on just the past 10 years or so, but of course the story of rising right-wing extremism goes back decades earlier. So let's just think about some of the views that Ben-Gvir and his buddies advocate for. Anti-LGBTQ, that non-Orthodox streams of Judaism are illegitimate, that Israel should annex the West Bank and require loyalty oaths of Arab Israelis and Palestinians in order for them to keep their Israeli citizenship, racism against Arabs and Palestinians in general. So backing up then, Rabbi Rafi Peretz used to be head of the right-wing religious Zionism party that Ben-Gvir is now associated with. He was seen as somewhat of a moderate and was interim Minister of Education under then Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2019. In 2019, he also came out in favor of conversion therapy, which claims to be able to turn gay people straight. We know that conversion therapy not only doesn't work, it's deeply harmful to people. But here we have the guy in control of the Israeli Education Ministry saying LGBTQ and queer people, they're not normal and need to be fixed. In that same time period, Peretz also referred to assimilation among diaspora Jews as being a, quote, second Holocaust. So we've got that disrespect toward diaspora Jews and non-Orthodox Jews who are the unspoken yet obvious target of this comment. Bezalel Smotrich, another member of the religious Zionism faction who ran in this election, together with Ben Gvir, is on record having said that Israel should be run under Orthodox Jewish law, leaving little room for non-Orthodox or secular Jews and Israelis. He has also advocated for segregation between Jewish and Arab mothers in hospital maternity wards. When it comes to Arab Israelis and Palestinians, both Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman, longtime politicians and former allies of Netanyahu, have expressed that Israel should annex at minimum Area C of the West Bank, which is about 60% of the area. Lieberman has previously advocated for Israel to revoke the citizenship of an entire section of northern Israel, which is largely Arab Israeli and Palestinian, and to give that area and all those people to whatever Palestinian state develops, regardless of how the people who live there feel about that. Oh, and if they want to stay in Israel and keep their citizenship, then they need to make, you guessed it, a loyalty oath. I'm not going to give an exhaustive list, but all of these guys are also on record saying racist stuff about Arabs and Palestinians. And perhaps most prominently, former and soon-to-be Prime Minister Netanyahu has also peddled racism against Arabs, famously saying that the Arabs are coming out to vote in droves to scare Jewish Israelis into voting for his party in elections. So the rhetoric and the extremism has already been there at the top in Israeli governments for years. They're not that far off from many of the same views held by Ben Gvir, and this is just a shallow slice of some of the views and politicians from the past decade who have advocated for this stuff. Now, there are a couple of things to understand about this. Israelis have, to be entirely blunt, a pretty distinct reason to lean further to the right. The wave of Palestinian terrorism in the Second Intifada from about 2000 to 2005 forever changed the Israeli landscape. The trauma affected a generation of Israelis, melted the Israeli left wing, which had been advocating for peace with Palestinians, and created a deep well of anger and resentment. There's a lot more to discuss here in terms of how Arab Israelis and Palestinians have felt toward Israel in this same time, but Jewish Israelis are really the basis of Israel's politics, and to streamline this episode, I'm focusing on that particular aspect of this. And it needs to be said, there's also a lot more to why Jewish Israelis are leaning right, but again, there's only so much I can cover, and the trauma of terrorism is one of the really big reasons for this. So with an environment that lends itself to more right-wing, intolerant, and bigoted politicking, that's what Israel has experienced. Netanyahu has actively stoked the flames even further over the past decade, elevating and platforming extremists to power as a result of coalition politics, including Ben Gvir. Netanyahu deliberately convinced the religious Zionism faction to accept and run with Ben Gvir in the elections to bolster his chance of becoming prime minister again. Netanyahu has also allied himself with ultra-Orthodox political parties who have worked hard to keep control of Judaism on a state level and to sideline reform and conservative Judaism. And here's where we transition from what this means for Israel to what this means for American and diaspora Jewry, and into my inflammatory thought from the start of this episode, because here's where it all kicks off for me. Israel's trend toward the right wing, toward bigotry and extremism, is really no surprise. It's not a new thing, and it doesn't take a whole lot of brain power to understand that if the trend is happening, it's likely to get worse in the future. So the rise of Ben Gvir and this generation of political extremists is deeply frustrating, to put it mildly, but also pretty expected, a when, not if event. Especially given Netanyahu's political strategizing with extremists, this was always on the horizon. But the mainstream American Jewish reaction that I've seen to all this is one of utter shock. This is unthinkable. And what follows is hand-wringing over, shit, how do we defend Israel now? As New York Times columnist and child of St. Louis Park Thomas Friedman wrote in a piece titled "The Israel We Knew Is Gone," quote, As that previously unthinkable reality takes hold, a fundamental question will roil synagogues in America and across the globe. Do I support this Israel or not support it? It will haunt pro-Israel students on college campuses. It will stress those U.S. diplomats who have reflexively defended Israel as a Jewish democracy that shares America's values. And it will send friends of Israel in Congress fleeing from any reporter asking if America should continue sending billions of dollars in aid to such a religious extremist-inspired government. You have not seen this play before because no Israeli leader has gone there before. End quote. The thing is, I think that's bullshit. And this is the start of what I mean by the Israeli election results are an indictment of mainstream American Jewish pro-Israel advocacy and thinking, which, let's boil down to its main component, the AIPAC, AJC, JFNA, Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations approach. When it comes to Israel, defend, defend, defend. If you're unsure that that's the main approach, just look at what AIPAC is doing now, raising money to donate to political campaigns only, and truly only, on the basis of candidates being their version of pro-Israel. I did an episode on AIPAC a little while ago if you want to revisit that for more details. By the way, defend, defend, defend has been an admirable strategy. It has gotten Israel to be the recipient of $3.8 billion a year in U.S. aid, and for the U.S. to be a key security and economic partner for Israel. Defend, defend, defend has also been the long-standing culture around Israel discourse in much of the Jewish community. But that strategy also seems to have put American Jewish institutions and many American Jews into a slow-boiled frog situation where we didn't notice the temperature was going up until it was too late. What do you mean previously unthinkable, Thomas Friedman? What do you even mean the Israel we knew is gone? What kind of reaction is that? This is the same Israel it always was, warts and all. The same trend toward extremism and the right wing. I'm bewildered by this sudden surprise. Why is the Israeli government only now indefensible? If you're only waking up and seeing the red line now, where have you even been the past decade? American Jews have been struggling for years to navigate the increasingly right-wing and orthodox politics of Israel. Journalists have already been able to walk up to pro-Israel members of Congress and ask, "You really think this Israeli government should get U.S. money?" If you're only waking up to this now, welcome to reality, and what made you think the previous status quo was sustainable? The discourse around college students is like a perfect microcosm of this. Gary Rosenblatt, the former editor-in-chief of the New York Jewish Week, who now writes a newsletter called Between the Lines, quoted Rabbi Eric Yoffe, the former president of the Reform Movement, in his piece about the Israeli elections. The rabbi said, quote, "Campus Israel haters will be dancing in the streets, holding BDS protests and passing out flyers with Ben Gvir's picture and past statements distributed on every elite campus in America." End quote. Once again, where the hell have you been? Here's the blunt truth that seems to have escaped so many people. Most anti-Israel activists, or however you want to call them, campus or not campus, don't care about what's new with Ben Gvir. They don't need to know the difference between him and Netanyahu or Avigdor Lieberman or Naftali Bennett or Bezalel Smotrich. The extremism Ben Gvir represents has been around for years and has been represented well enough by the rhetoric and policy priorities of other Israeli politicians. Anti-Israel activists on college campuses can have just as much of an impact simply printing out flyers with Netanyahu's picture and past statements on it, or the fact that he engineered Ben Gvir's rise to power. The question I have is, why is Ben Gvir suddenly indefensible, but everyone who came before him was apparently hand-waved away as being defensible, as fine as, this is the Israel we know? And all of this, in a convoluted way, is why I don't think that American Jewish pro-Israel institutions will have any real oh shit moment about this. Individual Jews, yeah, we can, oh shit all we like, but institutionally, if we've already gotten this far with little change to defend, we actually can keep going. The status quo doesn't have to change for these organizations who have already seemingly been ignoring or giving the bare minimum of attention publicly to American Jewish and diaspora concerns about Israel's direction. Their priority is defend, and you can walk around anything with that. Honestly, all the same lines also still work, even if they feel a little more bitter to say. Israel is a democracy, which means sometimes the people we don't like win. But hey, still a democracy in the Middle East. You can point to the lefties and centrists in Israel if you want, who are advocating for a liberal democracy with support of minorities, just like in the US. Ben-Gvir doesn't change that picture much, at least for the purposes of defend. You can still argue shared values. Also, for those of us who support Israel for reasons unrelated to who is in government, does it really matter if Ben-Gvir is around when, for example, U.S. funding for the Iron Dome helps protect all Israeli civilians, Jewish and non-Jewish alike? This sucks, but if it wasn't unforgivable to play along with the Israeli right wing, why should it be unforgivable now? So the status quo is likely here to stay at an institutional level, but we also need to recognize that defend is broken. In some serious ways, it hasn't served American and diaspora Jewry or Israelis well at all, and it's broken across both the Israeli side and the American side in a way that makes defend look like the Titanic. Iconic, but ultimately a sinking, flailing mess. Let's just look at what's been happening as part of the coalition negotiations in Israel as Netanyahu makes deals with the right-wing parties to help him create a government. A lot has been asked for when it comes to specific government ministries and priorities, but there's been a distinctly curious demand from Ben-Gvir, his buddies, and the ultra-Orthodox parties he is not affiliated with. They have demanded that, in exchange for joining Netanyahu in a government, that Israel's law of return be amended to let in fewer people. The law of return, a cornerstone of Israel and Zionism, states that anyone with a Jewish grandparent or who has converted to Judaism gets Israeli citizenship if they choose to immigrate to the country automatically. The law is a way of saying, even if you're not Jewish by classic Jewish law, or you don't see yourself as Jewish, you have enough Jewish heritage to be persecuted, to be attacked, to be killed for being Jewish. And in response to that, Israel is the safe haven. Israel will be available to you in your most dire times. This also ties into one of the classic truths of American Jewish pro-Israelism, that it's important to have a Jewish state as that safe haven for all Jews if, and inevitably when, things get bad for us. The law has been hugely important in helping Jews from the Soviet Union and post-Soviet countries come to Israel. Many Jews became intermarried in the Soviet Union, and even today there are people who only discover they're Jewish in Eastern Europe after a grandparent dies and admits their Jewishness on their deathbed. Especially with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the law of return has helped grant a safe haven to many Ukrainian and Russian Jews. So the law of return is, pretty important. And Ben-Gvir and the ultra-Orthodox parties want to change it to say, no, you only get to immigrate if your parents are considered Jewish. No longer do your grandparents count in any of this. That cuts out countless Russian-speaking and Eastern European Jews. It also cuts out countless American Jews as families become more intermarried and intermixed. And this is once again where I'm blown away. Not actually by the demands of these right-wing Israeli politicians, but by how feeble the American Jewish pro-Israel voice seems to be against this kind of thing. There's a story in the podcast notes from the Times of Israel about how William Daroff, CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, responded when asked about the demands around the law of return. He said, quote, "The law of return is a bedrock of Zionism." He also said he was, quote, "very concerned about the situation." That's it? Here's the thing. Coalition demands don't always become reality, and for the moment it's seen as unlikely that the law of return will be amended. And I'm not saying we need every Jewish organization to publish 1 billion strongly worded statements every time bad policies floated in Israel. But we know how unlikely things tend to become pretty likely eventually, especially with Israel's growing right-wing trend. So why does this seem to be the best that the CEO of the Conference of Presidents can publicly offer as the American Jewish voice against this, that he's, quote, "very concerned"? This just feels like it's throwing out years of American Jewish priorities in favor of defend. For years, American Jews rallied to help Soviet Jews with immense political action. More recently, American Jewry has sent hundreds of thousands of young adult Jews to Israel on the famous 10-day trip of Birthright to connect with Israel and their Jewish roots. The trip is literally called Birthright. How many of these American Jews aren't Jewish by classic Jewish law? How many are just discovering their Jewishness because a grandparent is Jewish? How many are going to intermarry and have kids and grandkids who are less and less Jewish by classic Jewish law? By the way, that's not a dig at intermarriage. I can't say that strongly enough. It's just a reality of what's happening. Many Jews who are paternally Jewish consider themselves Jewish enough in the US right now, even if by Orthodox standards they're not considered to be Jewish. And the entire Reform movement already accepts patrilineal descent, not just matrilineal. So how many of the American Jews or their descendants who went on birthright would actually be able to come to Israel under an amended law of return? Where's that birthright, huh? And the best we're offered is, quote, very concerned. It's like American Jewish pro-Israel organizations don't even have the language to advocate for diaspora Jewry or a more inclusive Jewish state because of the deference to defend. And I also can't help but ask, though this reeks of American Jewish arrogance, which is maybe a conversation for another time, how amazing is it that American Jews have spent so much money and advocacy getting the U.S. to support Israel, and Israeli politicians don't give a shit? Let's just cut all the Jews who we don't think are Jewish enough out of the future of Israel. Are our institutions so busy defending Israel they can't even advocate for the Jews on the whole? So from an Israeli side, defend in a really big way has failed both Israel and diaspora Jewry. The most powerful communal institutions of the largest Jewish community outside of Israel can't seem to advocate for us. On the American side, things are simpler to explain. Yes, Democrats and leftists have become a lot more critical of Israel, and that's unlikely to change. And while many of us are frustrated about some or much of that criticism being either unfair and at times anti-Semitic, a successful defend strategy would know how to engage critically about Israel's flaws and still get the support many of us find to be important. That's especially necessary for all the American Jews who struggle to defend Israel given all the issues we see. But I don't really see that nuanced approach happening anytime soon, and in fact, organizations like AIPAC have actively disavowed any critical conversation in the public sphere about Israel, given their approach to campaign contributions. But the thing I've heard less conversation about is that Republicans are now outside the scope of defend. How many Republicans from former President Donald Trump on down have complained about American Jews not being loyal enough to Israel, or to them for being pro-Israel? How many Republicans have been anti-Semitic even in just this past midterm election cycle, and when told to stop, they respond with some version of, well, but we love Israel, we can't be anti-Semitic, and you progressive Jews have no appreciation for us. Republicans don't care whether Israel is or isn't a liberal democracy that supports Arab minorities and LGBTQ rights. That classic line of shared U.S.-Israel values of democracy for the defend strategy is almost irrelevant. Republicans don't even like LGBTQ rights in the United States. And they hate the George Soros liberal American Jews as much as Ben Gvir and the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. If the law of return was amended, I can see these guys turning around and saying to American Jews, well, you weren't loyal enough to Israel. What did you expect? So how is defend supposed to exist in the long term? It fails to advocate for major priorities of diaspora Jewry and of Israeli Jewry. The present and future of Israeli politics seems not to care about it as long as they get that sweet U.S. aid money, and the present and future of American politics seems to have little need for it, bypassing the strategy almost entirely, even as they benefit from the sinking Titanic giving them campaign money. All of this stuff has been happening for years, but Ben Gvir and the reaction to his rise to power, I think, really illuminates it. And here's where finally I'm going to wrap this episode. God, I'm so excited to stop talking. Whatever, podcast anyway. So you might already be thinking, okay, so am I saying that American Jewish institutions shouldn't be defending Israel? Should they be conditioning U.S. aid to Israel on XYZ actions by the Israeli government? Should we all just get behind J Street or start boycotting Israel or whatever else you want to insert in that vein? First of all, I can't lie, a lot of those options are personally deeply uncomfortable to me. But also, I will take the out here, especially as this episode is so long, I'm getting loopy. Sometimes we have to recognize a problem first and then see how we address it. I like to talk solutions a lot of the time, but this is not one of those times. And honestly, all Israel discourse is so toxic so quickly, I don't even want to go there, though I'm sure inevitably I'll have to. For now, I think this is more than enough to simmer on and think about, especially as we watch for what does happen next. As of the release of this podcast, Israel still doesn't have a new government, and it'll be a few weeks until it does, assuming that Netanyahu is successful, which I think he will be. And then we see, will this Israel be too much for you? Will this government be too much to ignore? Does this whole situation just confirm all your priors about the state of Israeli politics and American Jewish Israel advocacy? And how much of whatever conclusions you reach will you actually share, particularly if you're a Jewish leader or professional? Those are the questions we can only answer for ourselves. And once we do, then I'm curious, what will our pro-Israel institutions do? And how long will they maintain the status quo until they have to jump ship or go down with the Titanic? This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.